we have Steve Hyer, who's going to be presenting Advocacy 101. He's been helping us with SNEAK since the very beginning, and he's been great to us. He's been helping us throughout. He's also one of the founders of the National Advocacy Conference and of SASA, which I said you'll hear about later. In addition to doing all of his advocacy work, he served as a mentor on 2 Hall of Fame teams, Team 27, Team Rush, and Team 1816, the Green Machine. There's a lot more in his bio, and I'm sure he's going to talk about it. So Steve, you can take it away if you are ready.
Hello, everyone. What is advocacy? How does it work? How do you get started? How are you really effective at it? And that's what this training is really all about, is making that advocacy that you're going to embark on more effective. To the very basics of what is advocacy. And I will say you can advocate really for anything to anyone, kind of anywhere. Advocacy is something very broad that doesn't need to be intimidating in any way. Advocacy, as far as democracy goes, requires an engaged, educated citizenry, and that really makes democracy work. If you know what you're showing up and voting for, and you know what the issues are, and you know who's going to accurately represent you, that's going to be a stronger democracy than a bunch of folks who are not educated and engaged. And so advocacy could be something simple like, hey mom, can I borrow the car tonight? I want to go to a movie. I want to go see I guess I probably shouldn't reference the movie that I want to go see right now. But let's say you want to use the car to drive your friends to a robotics tournament to do some scouting on week 1 to get ready for your week 2 competition. Maybe your parents are open to that. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's going to snow a little bit and they're going to say, hey, it's not a good idea for you to drive in the snow. And you're going to start coming up with reasons and rationale to say, hey, I've done this before. It's no big deal. The car is really lousy anyway. It would be a big deal if it was wrecked. You're going to come up with whatever ideas that is going to further your cause to try to get what it is that you want. And if mom says no, maybe you'll go ask your dad or grandma or grandpa or whoever to try to get that going forward. In college, a lot of times asking about your grades is something that you might want to do. So let's say you've got an A- and you participated in class a lot, and you want to go to the professor and say, hey, instead of an A-, I want an A. Hook me up. Here's some of the reasons why. Grades in college are completely negotiable. Highly recommend doing that. Highly recommend building a relationship with your professor for all the reasons that we're going to share with you here today. So some of the asks and some of the examples of things that we're advocating for could be things like, hey, our graduation school should contain a certain experience. The CTE is career and technical education. Maybe that's a statewide requirement. Maybe that's a local requirement. It could go either way. Certainly state funding should continue for REC or FIRST programs. That would be something that you could advocate for that is going to be part of the ask in at least a few of their states. And then maybe it's something as simple as every student should have some kind of STEM experience before they graduate. And that's really what our advocacy centers around, is that kids who don't have the experience that you've all had being on a robotics team should have access to be able to do that. And that's what we're really asking for. So in many ways, you're not even advocating for yourself, you're advocating for those who don't have access. And those tend to be very rural areas, very urban areas. And all of your states have, most of your states have urban areas. All of your states have some very rural areas. And that's where certainly advocating for those folks that, there's a big upside to having robotics more prevalent in those areas. All right, so how do you get started? And sometimes getting started is the hardest part. I know when I have a to-do list, I always do the things that are exciting that I want to do. I knock them off my list. It's very satisfying to cross something off my to-do list. And then there's always a few things on my list that I'm like, I don't really want to do that, but I found something else to do instead. And then once I get started on those things that stay on my to-do list, it takes 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I knock them out right away. And I think, well, why did I put that off for 3 days? I should have just done it and be done with it. And advocacy is a little bit like that, because there's nothing that mandates you to start. So you're going to get some training here today. Hopefully you're going to have some meetings and push the agenda to follow up here. And that's why these conferences are so powerful, because it really encourages you and engages you to get you started. But sometimes starting is the hardest part. And so how do you really get going? And I would say first, excuse me, first, you want to pick a target. Advocacy has to be directed somewhere. If you're not directing your advocacy somewhere, you're really doing public relations or branding campaign. And that is not what we're here to teach you how to do. That is something completely different. You want to pick a target. So if you want to advocate, when I was a senior in high school, our cafeteria was too small. And so they let us go out to lunch as a senior. And it was really kind of awesome. So we would do stupid things as seniors in high school, as you could imagine, like see how far away we could get and make it back to class on time. It was really a terrible idea from a safety standpoint, but it was really exciting as a student. And so let's say and it's since long gone, we don't do that anymore. But let's say as a senior, you wanted to advocate for open campus for seniors for lunch. If you go to your governor and your state legislature and you say, hey, I think we should have open campus for lunch, they're going to laugh at you, and maybe not outwardly, but they're going to be amused by your ask and say, hey, that's something you need to talk to your school board about and your superintendent about and your principal about. And they will absolve themselves of any responsibility for that. So knowing kind of where to pick that target is really important. If you're running a parade, your robotics team is running a parade, you've got to close the road for that parade. Well, if it's a state road, you probably have to talk to your state Department of Transportation. If it's a county road, you probably have to talk to your county Department of Transportation. If it's a local road, it might be your township or municipality that you're dealing with at that point. And so you've got to know who you're going after. So step one is really to pick a target. We'll talk about how it's sometimes easier to start more local, but you guys are branching out in the state level at this point, which is great. And step two is forming a relationship. If they know who you are, your advocacy efforts are going to go much further. And forming a relationship really is something that happens over time. If this is your very first time in advocacy, you may focus strictly on building a relationship and may not even get to the ask component of what we're going to talk about a little later this morning. And so it starts with being professional when you're requesting a meeting. How do you do that? How do you tell them who you are? How do you have all the information that you need in there? How are you polite and professional, and you asking them questions and getting to know them? And we'll talk a little bit more in the meeting section of how to do that in context of a meeting. But the more you have a relationship, the better your advocacy efforts are going to go. Way back when George W. Bush was president, he came up with something called the No Child Left Behind Act, which thankfully is long gone at this point. But in 2002, that act was implemented, and that was one of my first advocacy trips to Washington, D.C. And I started learning about all the issues and problems with it. You know, it said 100% of students would be proficient by the year 2014, which that's just not statistically possible. You know, why every student shouldn't even have the same bar for success. You know, if you had more than 1% of special education students in any given school, that school automatically fails and doesn't make adequate yearly progress. You know, there were a number of issues with the law. And so I went in 2002 and I was explaining this to a congressman at the time, and he looked at me and he said, "It says that?" And I thought to myself, you know, you passed it. What do you mean it says that? Like, I'm telling you what's in it. And I realized, like, when you pass a 1,000-page bill or an 800-page bill, like, they don't know exactly what they're voting on. They know some high-level things. And so it's our job as advocates to let them know, how does this legislation affect us? And so the next year I went back, and largely we're talking about the same things. And there were some other issues that had come up that we added in. You know, if you're a socioeconomically disadvantaged, racial minority, economically challenged person, like you fail the English language learner, like if you fail the state assessment, you might get 4 separate full failures that count against you as a school district. You know, so we add that on there. We continue to talk about it. In 2004, nothing still happened. Go back, talk about the same stuff. In 2005, 2006, fast forward all the way to 2014. Finally, we see some movement. And when the Every Student Succeeds Act was finally passed in 2015, all of the issues that I had talked about, I don't even want to think how many years that was, really going and kind of making the same pitch. Like at one point, I didn't even really need talking points because I had done it so much. I had it memorized cold of what the issues were and what the technical fixes that we needed were. And when Every Student Succeeds Act got passed, all of those issues that we had been advocating for over a decade were largely fixed. And that was because we had done that advocacy. We got everybody on the same page. Even as there are new folks involved, we brought them along and set that stage. And while it certainly did not go as fast as I would have hoped, and it certainly was a little bit of insanity going and doing the same thing and having no results, ultimately we prevailed and we got the Every Student Succeeds Act passed, which is a reauthorization of the of No Child Left Behind. It's a reincarnation with a bunch of new stuff in it. And part of that new stuff included a little blurb that allows some of those federal funds to flow through to local school districts. And one of the permissible uses is for after school STEM engagement activities like robotics. And so that was a huge win for us in that process. And that largely came because 1816 Green Machine in Minnesota developed a great relationship with their senator, Senator Franken. It's a long time, starts with that relationship building, and then ultimately settling in and getting something rolling there. All right, so I talked about maybe it's a little easier to start local, and that's what I wanted to pivot back to is your local school board, and when I'm talking in Massachusetts, I have to say school committee because you're the only state that calls it a school committee. Your local school board, school committee, your township, city officials, your county officials, sometimes those folks are more accessible than your state representatives or state senators or assembly persons. And sometimes it's easier to start local, but how you get going is really up to you. As a school board member, I live in the community that I represent. My kids go to the schools that I represent. I've been stopped in pumping gas before. I'm standing there and the guy says, "Are you on the school board?" And I have a moment of panic whenever I hear that because I'm like, "Oh God, what's next?" And so he says, he starts asking me about buses and something about bus maintenance. And it was advocacy at the gas pump. And it just so happened that, I was standing there and, not so much lately at the grocery store because I've been click listing more so, but prior to the pandemic, walking around the grocery store, Costco, I mean, it's like people come up to me and they're advocating. Sometimes they know they're advocating. Sometimes they're sort of slipping it in. It's sort of after the fact, but ultimately the people that I know and the people that are advocating to me as a school board member, certainly get farther. If I know them, I'm certainly going to, make more time for them. But any student that ever asks me to go see a program or to talk about a certain program, obviously I want to listen because the whole point of me being elected to represent my school district is to improve things. And so if somebody has ideas, I want to hear about it. If students want to be engaged in the process, I want to hear about it. So I would definitely recommend building relationships with your local officials. You may not have a specific ask right now, but if you make them fans of your robotics team, only good things can come from that, right? When I first got elected, we didn't have a robotics team. Robotics team came over several years later from another school. And, I thought I knew what it was all about, but, I didn't fully appreciate what the robotics team did or how it worked until I actually went to a competition. And so once I did, I sort of understood what the nerd Olympics at a robotics competition was really like and how crazy it was and how awesome an experience it was for students to go through that and gain the communication skills and confidence and all of those things that as an adult, you think kids don't have. And so going through a program that gives you skills that make you a great employee, that make you a great citizen of a democratic society, that make you a leader, those are all things that are great skills that you want to advocate for. And so, right, calling certainly still works. And then visiting in person is probably the best way to build a relationship. Visiting also could include Zoom. We'll talk about that a little later as well. But that's where getting that going, whatever method makes sense for you. Obviously, if somebody's in your local community, it's really easy to say, hey, could we meet for coffee or meet for lunch or, meet after school or, hey, come see our shop. Could we meet at the shop? That's much easier than, somebody who represents you in Washington or even at the state level. although your state representatives may live in your district and their kids may attend your school. So that's something we'll explore a little bit later. And so the takeaway here is it's relationship based, relationship focused. It's all about relationships. So as you embark on this advocacy path, think about it in context of it's your job and it's your goal to develop relationships with these folks that, depending on what ask and what issue and what you might need in the future, the relationship might be valuable for you. And along the way, you're making them a fan of maybe you as an individual, maybe your team, maybe your school. And those are all positive things and definitely things that will help. I wanted to share a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that I really like. Do what you can, where you are with what you have. And what this, my takeaway here is there's never a perfect scenario that you embark on. If you have never met your elected officials before, you may be thinking at this point, like, oh, I don't have that relationship. Well, you know what? There's never a better time to start than right now. You may have had a great relationship with an elected official and they didn't run for office again. And you're starting over. That's okay. Get started now and leverage the experience that you've had and move forward from this point. So there's never a bad time to start with advocacy. Some folks that have done this for several years, and maybe you have some relationships, you can sort of skip ahead a little bit. You still want to do your introductions and make sure they know who you are and you're developing those relationships, but sometimes you can then start to leverage those relationships by asking questions. Hey, how is the budget going to go? What do you see? How likely is this ask to happen? How do we strengthen our ask? You can get into asking some questions at that point. If you've never met with somebody, you're going to get into the basics of, hey, and you never really want to ask a question like, do you know what FIRST is? Because an elected official is never going to say, no, they have no idea what program you're in, right? They're going to say yes, and then they really don't probably know. And so it's your job to give them that firsthand information. What is robotics? What does your team do? Right? You could maybe assume you build a robot, but I think a lot of your teams, especially if you're on an advocacy webinar on a Sunday morning, are probably doing a heck of a lot more than just building a robot. And they're probably not thinking in terms of the confidence and the communication abilities and the coding and the manufacturing. I mean, all the different skills that go in. To affect a process, you have to know what that process is. And this sounds very simple, but this is something that I think trips people up in the advocacy realm quite a bit. And I started to allude to this a little earlier. Like, you certainly don't want to ask your state representative about an open campus for lunch for seniors. So figuring out the process is kind of step one. And that may be where your state is at, or you may know exactly what the process is and how to get where you want to go and you have that specific ask. And again, and that comes with building that relationship. And if you want to learn the process, you can start by asking questions. Hey, how does this work? And in some cases, you can Google, hey, school funding. Sometimes the process exists in a way that, here's the standard process, right? If you watch Schoolhouse Rock, How a Bill Becomes a Law, right? It's just such a simple and eloquent process of, the House introduces something and, it goes to committee and it passes as a law, and the Senate has a committee and it passes as a law. And then there's a conference committee and the president signs it or vetoes it, right? It's so simple. It's like, it doesn't actually work that way. It hasn't worked that way in a good long while. And so what is that real process that takes place? And so sometimes the process published online is the sort of academic process, but that's not necessarily how it really gets used. And so I would encourage you, if you're on the front end and getting started and needing to learn the process, by all means, ask a lot of questions. And don't ask in a sort of a pointed negative kind of way, like, hey, why do we have 5 different funding formulas in Connecticut? That doesn't make any sense. Like, don't go there. Just be open. There's a history. There's a reason why those exist. And nobody, you could try to assume nobody has made these funding processes in a way that's deliberately designed to hurt somebody. Understanding that process, really makes sense. Even at the local level, if you, let's say in high school, teacher accused you of using ChatGPT to write your assignment and gave you a 0 on it, and you did not use ChatGPT and you're protesting that, ruling. And so if you go right to the school board is going to say, did you talk to the teacher about this? And if you say no, they're going to say, go talk to the teacher. If you said, yes, I talked to the teacher, they're going to say, hey, did you talk to the principal about this? And you say no, they're going to say, hey, go talk to the principal. Yes, I talked to the principal. Then they're going to say, have you talked to the superintendent or the assistant superintendent or whatever that next layer is? Sort of understanding that chain of command, even in your school district, understanding if there's a policy that dictates, hey, I want to protest this grade, what options do I have? There could be a policy for that. Who gets to make that ruling? Whose ruling is final? In some cases, it might be a principal. In some cases, it might be a superintendent. In other cases, it might be the school board. But looking up those policies, which are typically online, and understanding what that process is what you absolutely need to do to affect that and ultimately get your assignment counted in that case. And on the state and federal level, it's no different. You've got to start somewhere. Do what you can with what you have. If the budget, isn't getting started for another 3 months, great. You're up ahead of it. You're setting the stage. You want to have an impact when it gets moving, build those relationships so you could leverage that when it gets moving. Maybe the budget is already set, the committees have met, and you're really talking about next year's budget at this point. Like, that's okay too, because you're going to affect next year's budget then. But knowing what budget year you're affecting is really important and gives you credibility in this. If you go in and you're like, hey, starting July 1, I want this money, I want this bill passed, and I want this money flowing to schools so we can have more robotics teams. And they're like, well, we just finished the budget. You lose credibility at that point. All right, so getting kind of going, we're building relationships, we're learning the process. That's where we're starting in advocacy. Your local school district, and I kind of alluded to this in the scenario I just painted, but there's a hierarchy, right? You have school committee members in Massachusetts and school board members everywhere else. They hire a superintendent. That superintendent runs the district. They may hire assistant superintendents, principals, assistant principals, vice principals, teachers, deans, support coaches, math coaches, behavior interventionists, a whole slew of staff members. If you're in a really rural small district, it's going to be a lot less layers and a lot smaller. If you're in a big urban district, there could be a lot more people involved with it. But knowing that chain of command is really important. And then certainly at the state level, your state has a governor that is the chief executive. There's a assembly body of sorts, could be a House and a Senate. Every state is a little different. Nebraska is the only one that has one body. Everybody else has two bodies. The names vary state by state. Your state has some sort of chief state school officer. That could be a state superintendent. It could be the head of the State Department of Education. But that chief state school officer is somebody that interacts with the federal government on a lot of federal programs and then oversees the state programs. And their power and authority is different in every state. And then certainly at the federal level, hopefully, we have a president and a vice president. There's cabinet level positions that the president appoints. And those are things like the Secretary of Education. They oversee the Department of Education, which includes special education, student loans, at-risk programs, a whole number of things that happen at the Department of Education. They have a very large building with a lot of staff, and that's something that they oversee. As states submit their plans at how to comply with the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. approves those or suggests changes to those. There's 435 members of the United States House of Representatives. Your state has a number of representatives based on population. You're where you live, you probably live in one representative's district. Your school district may have several representatives because the lines of the representatives that get redrawn every 10 years don't necessarily fit with city or county or school district lines. So if your school district has 2 representatives and you're advocating on behalf of your team and your school and the kids in your district, you may meet with both of them if you wanted to do some advocacy work. You might have 3 or 4, depending on how densely populated your area is and how those lines are drawn. And then there's certainly the United States Senate. There's 100 senators. There's 2 from every state. Even the small states have 2. The big populated states get 2, and those are folks that work together. A lot of times, both at the state and federal level,